In fact, now you could also see we could just start running raw SQL queries against this database. So if we right click on it and select new query, even though there won't be anything in here, I can select star from posts, for instance, and see that we have just empty data, but we have a working schema. Okay, awesome. So now let's go ahead and we'll minimize SQL Server Management Studio for now. And what I'd like to do next, I think, is to actually create our service layer. So we'll go ahead and minimize these two projects, and we'll right click on our solution and we'll add a new project. And we're going to call this lambda forums.service. And again, you'll see that it creates this empty class 1 file. Let's go ahead and just rename it. And we'll rename it forum service. And it's going to ask us if it would like to rename references to it, which in this case should just be its name. And if it fails, we can just do it ourselves here. So public class forum service. And so our service layer, in a sense, it will exist as a sort of way that our web project interfaces with our data. So we've defined all of our entity models in our data project, and our service layer, its whole job is going to be to actually take that data and then serve it in one way or another to our web project, specifically inside of the web project's controllers. And so, for instance, you can imagine if we, when we have a forum controller, that forum controller may want to have an index action where we display all of the forums. And so we need to basically query the database that we have for all of the forums that we want to display. And what we're going to do is to inject an instance of a forum service into that forum controller for it to actually handle all of the interaction with our actual data. So our controllers, everything in our web layer, it's really not going to be concerned at all with how the data is retrieved. It's just going to be concerned with how to manipulate the data that's retrieved into a suitable format to display to the user ultimately, or for the user to interact with in some way. But in fact, there will be one more layer of abstraction, sort of, if you will, or separation of concerns, and that is we're actually going to program against interfaces in our service layer. And what that will allow us to do with dependency injection is to actually inject interfaces in the constructors of our controller classes, which provides us with even more flexibility, perhaps with things like testing or other situations where we don't actually want a concrete instance of something injected into our controllers, but rather just the request a particular type of implementation, which we can then map in our startup.cs, where we actually create that mapping of the interface to its particular implementation. Okay, and hopefully this will all make more sense in just a moment here. So what we're going to do is have forum service implement the I4M interface, which we need to go ahead and create. And I'm going to create that in our data layer. So I'll just take this class 1 and we'll rename this I4M. Again, in our data layer, and rather than a public class I4M, we're going to make this a public interface I4M. And so the purpose of this interface is to, in a sense, define the behavior of our forum service, or any type of service that might want to interact with the forum data in our database. So if we're going to write some other API, some other implementation of the interaction with the forum entity model in our application, then this is where we want to define the various actions that any concrete implementation would need to implement. And so at the very least, we would want any concrete instance of a forum service to be able to get a particular instance of a forum by its ID. So we'll have a forum type, and want to be able to get a forum by its primary key. And so we can control period to bring the forum type in. Perhaps we want any implementation of a forum service to also be able to return the collection of all forums from the database. which might be useful on, say, an index page that contains all of the forums that we want to define. So we'll go ahead and bring in generic collections. And we could do similar things for, say, like a collection of user, where we want to get all active users for a forum. That would be sort of application user type. And then all of our standard CRUD applications. So we already have the ability to get forums, but we might also want the ability to create, update, or delete as well. So for those, we'll implement tasks, and we'll give the ability to create, where we just pass an instance of a forum to the create method, and we need to bring in system.threading.task. And task is sort of like void in a way, just in this case will actually represent an asynchronous event, and we'll look at that in a little bit here as well. And we'll just go ahead and name the parameter that we pass in forum. Likewise, we'll have a task to delete, and for that we really only would need an ID for a particular forum, so we'll say forum ID. And we'll just write a simple update method here, say to update the forum title or description, so we'll write one for each here. So maybe we would pass that a forum ID and then the new title. Likewise, maybe for description, we do something similar. Okay, so that's a pretty bare bones, simple interface with a few methods defined on it, which I think is good. So now if we head over into our forum service, you can see that we need the ability to actually bring this in. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, right click on our service project, and we're going to go ahead and add a reference to our data project and say OK. And now I'll control period here on I4M and bring in the appropriate namespace, and then we can control period again to actually implement this interface, which is going to go ahead and create each of those methods and just have them throw not implemented exceptions. Now this service, this concrete service that we're building here, will be what's actually interacting with our database. So we actually need to pass it an instance of our application DB context. And so to do that, we'll go ahead and just create a constructor for our forum service. If we control period on it, we can generate a constructor. And then inside the class itself, I'm going to create a private field for this application DB context. And so we'll just call it _context. And then we'll set it in the constructor here. Okay, so our forum service uses Entity Framework to interact with our actual data. And so let's go down to our getAll method, which may be the simplest of all of the methods that we're going to need to write here. But you can see that all we're going to do here is we need to return a collection of forums from our database. And so actually Entity Framework makes this very easy for us. We just use our instance of the DB context that we have, and on that, because we have a forums DB set, we have access to that here as a property, and just like that we can actually just return every instance of a forum from our database. Now the thing to note though is that on our forum model that we defined just a little while ago, we have this virtual posts navigation property, and so in order to actually load that explicitly, we need to actually call include here, and if we control period, we can bring in Entity Framework Core, and include just takes a lambda here. So we'll just call it forum, and we'll include posts. And so now when we return all of the forums from our database, all of the posts will now also be evaluated and will not be null when we call for all of our forums. So depending on how you were going to structure this, there may be cases when, of course, you wouldn't necessarily want to populate all of the posts that were on all of your forums when you retrieved all of them. But for our case, we're actually just going to include all of them here. So what I think I'd like to do now is, rather than go through and just kind of fill out all of these methods at once, is to kind of develop this a little bit more naturally and actually kind of get the web project up and going, so that we can kind of make the connection between how all of the parts of the application are working together. And so maybe the first thing we'll do is to maybe create a forum index where we actually make use of this getAll method down here in the forum service layer. So let's go ahead and do that. And so I'm going to go ahead and make a commit here. So just check out what we have changed. So we've removed this template class 1 that came in when we created a new project, our data project, and looks like we've modified our account controller, manage controller to fix those namespace issues, and we have some new files in both our data and service layer. So I'm just going to go ahead and git add all, and we'll commit. Add service layer. And again, if you have a remote repo, you can go ahead and push as well. So we have this getAll method in our service layer, and it's going to retrieve from our DB context all the forums and include the posts navigation property on them. And so what we're going to do now is head up into the web layer, and then we'll go into our controllers folder, and we're going to make a new controller here. And we'll just create it as an empty MVC controller, and we're going to call this forum controller. Okay, and so you can see that our forum controller is going to extend this abstract base controller class from the ASP.NET MVC framework. And so what we'll do here is actually inject an instance of our forum service from our service layer into the constructor of this controller. So if we actually just highlight the constructor or the class definition here and then control period, we can automatically generate a new constructor for it. And we're going to go ahead and make it public. So we're going to have a private read-only field here to store our I4M interface. And we'll control period to bring in our data layer. And I'm going to control period at the top here to remove the unnecessary usings. And then we're actually going to pass the constructor this interface. And notice that this is not a concrete instance of our forum service, but rather we're passing in this I4M interface. And then we're going to use dependency injection here. And we're going to tell .NET that anytime we ask for something that implements this I4M interface, to go ahead and pass that a concrete instance of our forum service. But our controller only really cares about the actions, if you will, the behavior of this interface. That keeps our controllers actually kind of nicely independent of any concrete classes that we program against this interface. Okay, and so you can see that when we created this controller, Visual Studio created this iActionResult index for us. And so this is a return type for our controller methods. And basically we can return lots of different things here. We could return a view, we could return a status code, for instance, or some JSON data. We're actually going to return a view, and we're going to use a new view model and pass it to our view here. So let's take a look at how that's going to work. So if you think about it, this index page of our forums, so if you think about it, this index action on our forum controller may return just all of the forums that are in our database, for instance. So if we have a relatively small number of forums, that might be a perfectly reasonable thing for a forum index to do. So let's go ahead and store our forums in a forums variable here. And what we're going to do is just simply invoke the forum service, and we've defined the getAll on our interface and implemented it in our actual forum service class. And so now if we getAll here, notice the type here is going to be an enumerable collection of forums. And I'll bring in the usings just so that we can see that. And so this forum object is actually our entity model. This, if you remember, is actually what Entity Framework is using to actually map this C# object back to the representation of this data in our data store. So we actually don't want to pass our raw entity model down to the view. And so what I'd like to do is to actually use a view model to represent the data that we pass down to the view. And so since this is an index page, we don't need to pass the entire forum object down to the view. We can go ahead and create a simplified view model for that and use the data that we get back from the database and kind of wrangle it into that view model. So what we're going to do now is inside the models folder here, which is in the web projects. This is our view models. We're going to go ahead and add a new class. And let's go ahead and just call this forum listing model. And in fact, I'm going to also create a new folder here in the models directory, and we're going to call it forum. And then I'm just going to go ahead and drag this forum listing model into that directory and say OK. And then since this folder is a namespace provider, I'm also just going to make the namespace lambda forums.models.forum, and then control period here to clean up our usings. And so we've got this public class forum listing model. This is also going to be just a simple POCO class. And we'll definitely still want the ID. And so the ID is going to represent still the primary key on the actual forum entity model that comes down into getting pushed into this view model. So we'll have many of the same properties here. Still have a name that we might want to display on the listing, a description of the forum. And so let's just keep it at that for right now. Obviously this will get more complex here in just a few minutes, but for now let's just go ahead and create this simple view model and see if we can populate it using data from our database, which we can actually just insert using some raw SQL here in a moment. So, all right, so this is our view model. We'll head back into the controller, and so now we're getting all of our forums back from the database via the service layer and the method that we wrote to get all of those objects. Now what I'm going to do is use link to actually map the properties that are on each of those forum objects into instances of our new forum listing model object. And we can use the select operator to do that. So I'll control period to bring in link. And just create a lambda here to create new instances of our new forum listing model. And control period here to bring in the models.forum namespace. And now we just define the structure of each of those forum listing model objects that we're going to get back. So you can think of the link select statement if you haven't used link before as sort of like a map function. So let's go ahead and fill it out. So we have an ID, a name, and a description to fill out here. So we're going to map the ID directly to the forum ID. And so you can kind of see now how this lambda is working. This representing each of the objects that we're getting back from our getAll method. Name is equal to forum.title is what we actually called it. Perhaps we'll go ahead and change that in our forum listing model in a moment here. And description just maps one-to-one also with description. And note now that our return type is not actually a collection of our forum entity models, which is what our getAll method returns here, but now it's a collection of our forum listing models. And so we can see that here if we just change this to forum listing model. And in fact, we could simplify this further by just using var here. So we've got a list of our forums here now tucked into this sort of forum listing model format. And what I'm going to do is now also in our models directory and then under forum is go ahead and create a view model for that index page. So create a new item here. It's just going to be a class and we'll call it forum index model. This is going to be a pretty lightweight class that for now simply just wraps a collection of our forum listing model. So we'll just have a single property for now. Be a public enumerable forum listing model. and we'll call it forum list. Okay. And so this model is what we're actually going to pass down to our view. Now we could actually just simply pass this collection of forum listing models down to our view. That's one way to do it. But I actually like to create view models for each of the views, even if they are simply lightweight wrappers for other view models that are getting passed. Because you might imagine in the future this page getting more complex and having more data to display than simply a collection of forum listing models. And the way that we've set it up here, I think, makes it more flexible in that manner. So come back to our controller now, and we'll go ahead and define a new instance of that class. So we'll say var model is equal to new forum index model. And we'll simply set the forum list equal to our forums. And so finally, all we have to do now is to pass this model to our view. And so the MVC framework is going to be looking for a view called index in a folder called forums. So what we're going to do now is expand our views directory here, and we're going to create a new directory called forum, and in it we'll create an index view. And I actually like to create the view manually here. I think this the view that it scaffolds out sometimes has a little bit more than we actually require, and sometimes it takes a little time. So what we're going to do is simply just create a new MVC view page, and yeah, just call it index.cshtml. And now at the top of the page, we can go ahead and get rid of this. And on the very first line, we can define the model that we would like to pass to this view and have access to in our CSHTML file here. And so it is, of course, the view model that we just created, so lambda forums.models.forum.forum index model. And so what this is going to allow us to do is to actually use Razor to have access to the properties that are on the particular forum index model that we pass this view. So in our controller, we just created a forum index model. We populated its only property forum list here using our service layer to get all the forums back from the database and map them to properties on our forum listing view model. And so yeah, now we're passing that entire wrapped forum index model to our view. And then in our view, we're simply referencing that here on the first line. And now the simplest thing that we could do is, like, let's just have an h1 tag here and say forums. And then we'll use some Razor syntax here with the spiral, and then we'll just say for each. And then we can kind of write C# here. So we could say like var forum in model.forum list. And so capital M model here and lowercase m model at the top. And maybe we just make this a table. We could make it a list, but it's going to end up being a table anyway. So let's go ahead and just wire that up. So we'll have a table. We can use Bootstrap here. We'll give it an ID. We won't worry about creating a table head for now. We'll just have a t body. And then we'll tuck our for each inside of our t body so that we can have new table rows for each of the forums that we're going to get back from our database. So we'll have a new row for each forum. And then we'll have columns for each of the different properties. And we can reference those properties again using the @ symbol. So we use our forum variable here, and this now is an instance of our forum listing model. And so we can simply say like name, and we'll have another column here for the description. Okay, so this is our simple view. It's our first view, and let's go ahead and actually just start the application and make sure everything is wired up correctly.